Okay, going to talk here about the last 15, 16 months of World War I. We're going to begin in the spring of 1917, early spring, late winter 1917, and we're going to go up to the armistice, which is in November 1918. In the spring of 1917, the Germans looked okay if you look at a map. They are really sort of pushing back the Germans. They're in Russian territory. And they're holding their own in the West versus the English and the French. But the German high command knows that things are actually, that their situation isn't good at all. The blockade's having a real effect. Remember, the German Navy has essentially been, sort of a non-factor since December 1914. The English set up a blockade. In late fall 1914, essentially not allowing anything in and out of the German ports. Now the Germans are able to come relatively close to feeding themselves, but they can't quite at this point. And the Germans would not have been able to manufacture enough ammunition and weapons to fight the war had it not been essentially for the discovery of the ability to synthesize nitrogen, which is a pretty key component in ammunition. A lot of the ammunition was made through fertilizer before this is sort of the ability to do it in a laboratory is made, and then then you blow that up and you can manufacture nitrogen essentially. A lot of it was made through bird droppings, guano. Guano was a major commodity traded guano. Oh, it's bird droppings. Anyway, but Fritz Haber is a German scientist who sort of figures out how to synthesize it, again in a laboratory, and allows the Germans to be able to continue to fight. But still, things are not good. There is people are going hungry in Germany. Even some of the German soldiers are struggling with having enough to eat because of the blockade. It's working. So the Germans decide they have to change the game. They can't continue this situation. They do it in a couple ways. One is they decide, can we defeat the Russians? The problem with and they are really defeating the Russians, but this could take a couple of years. The Russian army is enormous. It's huge. Getting to Moscow, if you figure that, all right, if we can get to the capital, that'll sort of, or maybe St. Petersburg, that will force force the Russians to retreat or to surrender. There's a lot still. They're pretty deep into Russian territory, but Russia is an enormous, entity, and getting to the capital is going to take a while. And even though we're defeating the Russians, they just keep sending more and more military units, and they're not very well equipped. They're not very well trained. A lot of them aren't going to fight because what are they fighting for? This absolute monarch? They just want to go home. They're not fighting. They don't feel like they're fighting for their nation, right? But it's going to take a while. So the Russians said, the Germans said, we got to get the Russians out. In the spring of 1917, the Russian people are suffering pretty severely as well, because where the Germans are is where a lot of the food is grown that feeds the Russian people. Places now like the Ukraine, it's a huge, it's sort of maybe only second to, and maybe it's even, I don't know, if it doesn't produce as much food at this point as the United States can. Even now, the Russians, grow a lot of food there, from the sort of border of Russia to the Ural Mountains. Good soil, good temperate soil to raise, wheat and soybeans and corn and the like. The Germans said, we got to change the game. Protests began in Russia, and there were protests in 1905. 12 years before, after the Russians are defeated by the Japanese. Whenever you have a defeat like that, it makes people angry. They say, what's wrong with us? How did this happen? And protests begin, and the Germans know this. Everybody has spies everywhere. And Lenin is living in Germany. He was part of the 1905 sort of uprisings, and he fled Russia, and he ends up in Germany. And the Germans keep him around because they figure that he might be useful. So the Germans put him on a train with some of the other sort of some of his colleagues, and they send him back to Russia to cause trouble, and it works. The Tsar abdicates, meaning sort of he gives up his power because of these protests and the like. Because the army in 1905, the army and the police backed the Tsar, and so they were able to put down these revolts, these protests. A lot of people were killed, but the army and the police don't back the Tsar this time. They back the people, and so the Tsar realizes the jig is up, and he abdicates. The whole royal family is killed in the summer of 1917. There's a provisional government set up, made of sort of the middle class, essentially, right? This is sort of the first step of the Russians having their French Revolution. The people want to get out of the war. The provisional government decides not to. They decide we're going to continue to fight this war. We can still, we can win it. Lenin shows up, and he starts, sort of giving speeches and getting people riled up. And he says, if I become leader, we'll get out of the war. You can trust me. The people like that. There's another revolution in October, and then there's another one in November of 1917 with, now, like I said, the provisional government's in charge. And Lenin takes power. And Lenin does get out of the war. In early 1918, he signs a peace treaty with the Germans, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and he gives up a whole lot of land to the Germans. This is a great victory. Their plan worked. We sent Lenin in, and he got done what we wanted him to get done. Now things really look good for the Germans, right? They defeated the Russians, who they weren't sort of supposed to really be able to defeat, at least with, while fighting a two-front war. And look at all this land we got. Why would Lenin give up all that land? He didn't care. Lenin certainly thought that communist revolutions were going to happen everywhere. He thought that they would happen very soon. So I don't care about giving up all this land, because all these states are going to disappear anyway. We're going to end up with just communism everywhere. So, he doesn't care. It doesn't cost him. He really believed that. Stalin does not. And Lenin will die shortly after World War I, and Stalin will take over. And, if you believe in communism, then you have this vision of the future that it's going to end. So, all of these things are going to end. Capitalism and all these nation states are going to go away. So who cares? Stalin doesn't believe that, but Lenin does. And Lenin's still in charge till 22. I think Lenin dies. All right. Germans. They've defeated the Russians. Now they only have a front. Go back to 1917. The Germans don't know that this plan of sending Lenin there will work, and the Russians get out of the war. So at the same time as they're thinking, we got to change the game in the East, they say we got to change the game in the West. The U.S. is equipping our enemies with food and with bullets, beans and bullets. We've got to stop this. They had submarines, right? These U-boats. And early in the war, they had sunk a number of ships. Now, there were rules that went along with this. You had to allow these ships to, first of all, you could only attack military ships, and you had to allow everybody to get off. You were targeting the boat and what the boat was carrying. The problem is the Germans knew that the Americans were sending supplies to the Allies, not just on sort of military ships or ships that were flagged to say we're carrying military supplies, but also on passenger ships. And the Germans have a debate. Should we say, because and that's actually a violation of international law as well. The Germans have a debate. Should we just start sinking these ships? We'll warn them, but then we're just going to sink them. We're not going to let everybody necessarily get off. We're going to warn you beforehand, and then it's open season, because you're violating sort of international law. Should we do that, or should we continue to not use our U-boats? The U.S. had warned them in 1915, if you keep doing this, we're going to get in the war. So the Germans stopped. We don't want to get the U.S. into the war. 2 years later, it's a wild card. It's a risk. It's a gamble. But maybe it will knock out, if we can essentially blockade the English and the French with our U-boats, because our above surface navy is gone, we can change the dynamic, and we can sort of starve the French and the English, and we'll win. Or this war will at least be over. A lot of the Germans debate it because they realize if we do this, the U.S. may get into the war. But the idea is, and everybody sort of agrees with that, but maybe we can knock out the French and English quick enough that the U.S. really won't, because it's going to take a while. It takes about a year when the U.S. says we're into the war. It takes about a year for a lot of troops to show up. So it's, again, this debate's going on. Should we do it? They decide to. They also decide to send a telegram to Mexico and say, look, you're still probably smarting from losing the Spanish-American War and losing basically, what is now Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. Although a lot of those aren't states yet, but they lost the territory. If you invade the U.S., that'll keep at least a good chunk of the U.S. Army busy. It'll help you and us. The U.S. will be fighting a two-front war because they figure the U.S. is going to get involved now. The British intercept this. They, of course, show it to Woodrow Wilson. It gets published in newspapers. People in this country get really angry at this. And so now we're in the war. And the Germans are now, engaged in submarine warfare again. So the U.S. joins the war. So the gamble works in the East. It backfires in the West, you could say. That's the situation. The U.S. then enters the war in the spring of 1917. There are a few American troops that are there very quickly because they'd already sort of been staged thinking that this would happen. But really it takes until 1918 for it to really be effective. The Germans in 1917 start to create more offensives, again, because they think we got to get this thing over with before the entire U.S. Army can show up, which actually the U.S. Army is very small, but they know that it's going to take them a while, but they're going to be able to wield sort of a very large army, and it doesn't work. By 1918, the U.S. is fully there. The Germans, again, they're really sort of rolling the dice. There's a number of sort of very risky offensives. Some pretty successful for a while, but then they start falling back, and things are really looking very, very bad for the Germans in summer of 1918. They realize that we really can't go on. Again, the army is doing okay, but things at home are horrendous. People are starving now. Protests are beginning. And the German High Command learns from their intelligence wing that if we fight this into 1919, we have a very good chance of having a communist revolution, and there'll be basically a communist Germany, like what happened in the Soviet Union. The people are angry, they want out of the war, they don't really care about winning it. That's the deal. So in November, again, the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, an armistice is agreed upon. Remember, an armistice is not the end of the war. It is a ceasefire while a treaty can be worked out. The Germans believe that it's been a tie. They defeated the Russians in the East, and it's essentially a stalemate in the West. Or maybe the Germans actually won, right? They're not fighting on German territory. We are fighting on French territory and some Belgian territory. We still have the upper hand, but there's something dishonest. So that's what the majority of the people believe. The German High Command realizes that, yes, that's true, but we have to get out of this war now. They could always start fighting again. That's always an option. And when they meet, when the sort of both sides meet in Versailles to hammer out a peace treaty, when the Germans learn, I'm just going to foreshadow a little bit, when the Germans learn about what they're going to have to sign, there are people who say, we're not going to sign it. Let's start fighting again. Again, the German High Command realizes that's impossible. If you try to do that, if you announce that to the people, that, yeah, this peace treaty is bad, but we're going to fight again, a lot of people are going to lose their heads. There could be a revolution. So the Germans can't really do that. Okay. That's it for this week. Next week we'll talk about the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, and we'll talk about everything up to the interwar period till World War II begins.